behind Britain's gilded thrones stood monarchs who shaped reality as it was understood to maintain their grip on power. Tonight, we journey through 18 royals who mastered the art of psychological control, twisting truth, rewriting history, and shaping perception until even those closest to them questioned their own minds. From queens who erased inconvenient facts to kings who constructed elaborate illusions, these stories reveal how crowns were kept, not through force alone, but through carefully crafted manipulation of reality itself. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, dim the lights, settle in, and let the pace slow. Feel free to comment where you're listening from. Early evening in London, middle of the night in Sydney. We appreciate your company during these quiet hours. Now, let's begin. Number 1. King Henry VIII, the master of divine revision. How does a king convince an entire nation that truth is whatever he declares it to be? King Henry VIII, who ruled England from 1509 to 1547, mastered the art of reality distortion on a scale that transformed not just individual minds, but the very foundations of English society. Born in 1491, Henry didn't merely demand obedience. He required subjects to believe that his constantly shifting positions had never changed at all, that his reversals were continuities, and that those who remembered differently were traitors to an objective truth that existed only in his proclamations. The Crown insisted that each of Henry's marriages and divorces was undertaken for the purest of motives, even as the stated reasons contradicted previous equally sincere declarations. When Henry broke with Rome to marry Anne Boleyn, he framed it as a matter of conscience and divine truth. Historical sources document how he required not just compliance, but genuine belief, demanding subjects accept that his actions stemmed from newly discovered religious truth rather than personal desire. When he later executed Anne on charges of adultery, the Crown insisted this too was justice, that the marriage had been invalid from the start. Reality suggested otherwise, but contradicting the king's version of events became treasonous. Thomas More's execution demonstrated the system's ruthlessness. More had served Henry loyally, but refused to publicly affirm that Henry's marriage to Anne was valid under God's law. His silence wasn't enough. The Crown required active affirmation of Henry's narrative. More's execution sent a message that truth was whatever the king declared it to be. Yet the narrative remained consistent in the king's telling. He had always acted righteously. His conscience had always guided him purely, and those who died under his orders had brought their fates upon themselves through disloyalty to self-evident truth. Henry's systematic rewriting required subjects to hold contradictory beliefs simultaneously without acknowledging the contradictions. The very definition of loyalty became accepting the king's version of events, regardless of what one had witnessed or remembered. This wasn't merely political propaganda. It was comprehensive reality distortion that made subjects question their own perceptions when they conflicted with royal pronouncements. Henry died in 1547, having transformed England's religion, politics, and relationship to truth itself, leaving behind a legacy where power's greatest tool wasn't the sword, but the ability to make subjects doubt their own minds. Number 2, King James I, the divine right of selective reality. King James I, who ruled England from 1603 to 1625 after years as King of Scotland, wielded intellectual manipulation with a sophistication that made subjects question not just facts, but the very framework through which they understood power and truth. Born in 1566 into a world of conspiracy and violence, James developed a worldview where his divine right to rule meant that his interpretation of events was not merely authoritative, but definitionally correct, creating a system where disagreement with the king became disagreement with objective reality itself. The Crown insisted that James's authority came directly from God, making opposition not political difference, but theological error. Historical sources document how James articulated this theory with scholarly precision in his writings, where he argued that kings were accountable only to God. This wasn't merely political philosophy. It created a framework where the king's version of events carried divine sanction. When subjects questioned royal actions, they weren't engaging in political discourse, but challenging God's appointed representative. Reality suggested a more complex political landscape, but James's framework made acknowledging that complexity treasonous. His obsession with witchcraft and conspiracy demonstrated how this reality distortion operated. James saw plots everywhere, and his conviction that conspiracies existed made them real in governmental action regardless of evidence. Those accused faced a system where the king's suspicions constituted proof, where denial confirmed guilt by demonstrating skill at deception. The very act of defending oneself became evidence of the conspiracy's depth. Yet the narrative remained that James was protecting his realm from genuine threats, that his vigilance uncovered real dangers rather than manufacturing them. His treatment of those who questioned his judgments revealed the system's circularity. If you agreed with the king's interpretation, you were loyal and wise. If you questioned it, your very questioning proved you were part of the threat he was defending against. This created an environment where reality became whatever James declared it to be, and those who remembered events differently learned to doubt their own memories, rather than contradict the divinely appointed interpreter of truth. James died in 1625, having created a governmental system where the king's word didn't just have the force of law, but defined the nature of truth itself. Number 3. Queen Mary I, the salvation of forced reality. Queen Mary I, who ruled England from 1553 to 1558, constructed a reality where religious persecution became spiritual rescue and suffering transformed into divine mercy. Born in 1516 as Henry VIII's daughter, Mary spent years watching her mother be cast aside and her own legitimacy questioned, experiences that apparently shaped her capacity to reframe painful truths into narratives that served her purposes. Her brief reign demonstrated how thoroughly one could distort reality when convinced of absolute righteousness. The Crown insisted that the burnings of Protestant heretics were acts of love, saving souls from eternal damnation through temporary earthly suffering. Historical sources document how Mary's government framed these executions not as punishment, but as final opportunities for salvation. The flames of the stake burning away heresy to reveal the possibility of last-moment redemption. This reframing required subjects to see what their eyes witnessed, people dying in agony, as fundamentally different from what it appeared to be. The Crown's narrative insisted these weren't persecutions, but mercies, not violence, but spiritual medicine. Reality suggested otherwise, as evidenced by the name history gave her, Bloody Mary. Contemporary accounts describe widespread horror at the scale and intensity of the burnings. Nearly 300 people were executed for heresy during her 5-year reign, a pace that shocked even those accustomed to religious conflict. Yet the Crown insisted this proved England's dire spiritual need. That resistance to the burnings demonstrated how thoroughly Protestant heresy had corrupted the realm, requiring even more vigorous correction. Yet the narrative remained that Mary was restoring truth and saving souls. Those who questioned whether burning people alive constituted Christian mercy were themselves demonstrating the depth of heretical thinking that needed correction. The system created a closed loop where opposition to the policy proved the policy's necessity. Mary surrounded herself with advisors who reinforced this reality, creating a court where the Queen's interpretation of events went unchallenged and questioning the righteousness of the burnings became itself a dangerous position. She died in November 1558, having convinced herself that her reign had saved England spiritually, even as it traumatized the nation, demonstrating how completely one can distort reality when religious certainty and political power combine to create a worldview where horrifying actions become reframed as holy necessities that only the spiritually blind would question. Number 4. King Charles I. Denial until collapse. King Charles I, who ruled England, Scotland, and Ireland from 1625 until his execution in 1649, maintained an interpretation of political reality so divorced from actual circumstances that even as civil war erupted around him, he insisted he governed with his subjects' full support and blessing. Born in 1600 as the second son who never expected to rule, Charles developed an unshakable conviction in his divine right to govern as he saw fit, creating a framework where any opposition to his will was by definition illegitimate, regardless of its scale or source. The Crown insisted that Charles's rule enjoyed natural and proper support from all righteous subjects, that resistance came only from a misguided minority manipulated by ambitious troublemakers. Historical sources document how Charles interpreted every parliamentary challenge to his authority as the work of a small faction, rather than legitimate grievance from a substantial portion of his kingdom. When Parliament refused to grant him taxes without addressing their concerns, Charles framed this as a few agitators preventing the natural cooperation that should exist between king and subjects. Reality suggested increasingly desperate political circumstances. Charles's attempts to rule without Parliament for 11 years, his religious policies that alarmed Protestants, and his apparent sympathy toward Catholicism created genuine widespread opposition. His Scottish policies triggered the bishops' wars, draining his treasury and forcing him to recall Parliament. Yet even as these failures accumulated, the Crown's narrative remained that Charles governed wisely and that problems arose from subjects failing to understand or appreciate his leadership. Yet the narrative remained unchanged even as civil war became inevitable. When Charles attempted to arrest 5 members of Parliament in 1642, forcing them to flee, he still insisted he was the wronged party, that his actions were justified responses to sedition rather than provocations that pushed moderates toward opposition. Throughout the Civil War, Charles's correspondence reveals a man who genuinely believed that most of his subjects supported him and that the rebellion represented a minority who had temporarily misled others. This conviction made compromise impossible. How could one compromise with those who were objectively wrong about reality itself? His trial and execution in January 1649 came after years of refusing to acknowledge that his interpretation of events differed fundamentally from what his subjects had experienced, demonstrating how thoroughly one can maintain an alternative reality, even as it leads directly to the scaffold. Number 5. King Richard II, the delusion of universal love. King Richard II, who ruled England from 1377 to 1399, constructed an elaborate fiction of universal adoration and divine favour that became increasingly detached from the political reality of growing noble opposition. Born in 1367, Richard inherited the throne as a child and apparently never developed the ability to distinguish between the deference people showed his office and genuine support for his person and policies, creating a framework where criticism became impossible to process as anything other than inexplicable betrayal. The Crown insisted that Richard enjoyed the love and loyalty of all true Englishmen, that his rule was blessed by God and embraced by his subjects. Historical sources document how Richard surrounded himself with advisors who reinforced this vision, creating a court culture where challenging the king's interpretation of his popularity was itself disloyal. As Richard's policies alienated powerful nobles, the gap between the Crown's narrative and political reality widened dramatically, yet the king appeared genuinely unable to recognize opposition as legitimate grievance rather than moral failure. Reality suggested a kingdom increasingly divided. The Lords Appellants' rebellion in 1387 forced Richard to watch helplessly as his favourites were executed or exiled, a humiliation that should have demonstrated his actual political weakness. Yet Richard appeared to internalise this as temporary setback caused by a few traitors, rather than evidence that his support was far more limited than he believed. For the next decade, He maintained outward cooperation while apparently planning revenge against those who had humiliated him. Yet the narrative remained that Richard was beloved and his authority unquestioned. When he finally moved against the Lord's appellant in 1397, the viciousness of his revenge suggested years of resentment at treatment he considered inexplicable. His demand that subjects sign blank charters, essentially giving him power to accuse them of anything later, revealed a king who saw opposition as proof of moral deficiency requiring preemptive control. The speed of his deposition in 1399, when Henry Bolingbroke invaded and Richard's support evaporated almost instantly, demonstrated how thoroughly his belief in universal adoration had been divorced from reality. He died in captivity in 1400, apparently still struggling to understand how subjects he believed loved him had abandoned him so completely. His entire reign a demonstration of how dangerous it becomes when rulers cannot distinguish between the respect shown to their office and genuine support for their person. Number 6. King George III, the court's collective fiction. King George III, who ruled from 1760 to 1820, experienced periods of severe mental disturbance that created a situation where those around him constructed careful fictions about governmental stability, even as the king's capacity to govern deteriorated dramatically. Born in 1738, George began his reign as a capable monarch, but his recurring episodes of altered mental state created a system where the truth about the king's condition became something that could not be openly acknowledged, requiring elaborate collective agreement to maintain appearances of normal governance. The Crown insisted, through George's ministers and family, that the king's health issues were temporary and that governance continued smoothly under his direction, even during periods when this was manifestly not the case. Historical sources document how those closest to George developed elaborate protocols for managing his episodes while publicly maintaining that everything remained normal. Bulletins about the king's health used carefully chosen language that technically wasn't false, but created impressions quite different from the reality physicians were observing. Reality suggested a monarch experiencing significant difficulties. During his first major episode in 1788 to 1789, contemporary accounts describe George's behaviour as so altered that those around him struggled to maintain the fiction of normal governance. Yet publicly, the system worked to minimise the severity and implications of the king's condition. Those who suggested the king might not recover faced accusations of disloyalty, as if acknowledging the observable reality constituted betraying the monarch rather than facing difficult truths about governance. Yet the narrative remained that George's condition was manageable and temporary, even as episodes became more frequent and severe. The system created a situation where everyone involved knew the truth, but agreed to maintain a public fiction, with careers and positions depending on supporting the official version rather than acknowledging what they witnessed. By 1810, when George's mental state had deteriorated beyond any pretense of recovery, the appointment of the Prince Regent finally acknowledged what had been obvious for years. The king spent his final decade in seclusion, blind and deaf, and largely disconnected from reality, while the governmental system maintained respectful fictions about his condition until his death in 1820. This demonstrates how collective reality distortion can operate even with benevolent intentions, where the desire to protect the monarchy and maintain stability required sustained agreement to describe situations in ways that diverged from observable facts, creating a system where truth became subordinate to institutional needs. Number 7. King Henry II, the architecture of plausible denial. King Henry II, who ruled England from 1154 to 1189, mastered the art of creating situations where responsibility could be denied, even when consequences were clearly intended, constructing a framework where his words and wishes could produce results while maintaining official distance from the actions taken in his name. Born in 1133, Henry built an empire through a combination of military skill and political acumen that included the ability to communicate desires in ways that preserved deniability when outcomes became problematic. The Crown insisted that Henry bore no responsibility for the murder of Thomas Becket in 1170, that his words expressing frustration about the Archbishop had been misinterpreted by overzealous knights who acted without royal authorization. Historical sources document the incident that became infamous: Henry's outburst, questioning why no one would rid him of the troublesome priest, words spoken in the hearing of knights who then travelled to Canterbury and murdered Becket at the altar. The Crown's subsequent narrative framed this as tragic misunderstanding, rather than the predictable result of a king expressing violent wishes to armed men predisposed to action. Reality suggested a system where Henry regularly communicated desires indirectly, allowing subordinates to interpret and act while he maintained official distance from unsavoury methods. This created a court culture where reading the king's true wishes became essential for advancement, yet acting on those wishes carried personal risk if circumstances made the king's official denial necessary. Those who served Henry learned to understand what he wanted without him stating it explicitly, creating a framework of shared understanding that everyone involved recognized while officially denying. Yet the narrative remained that Henry was shocked and grieved by Becket's murder, that he had never intended such an outcome. His public penance, walking barefoot to Canterbury and allowing monks to scourge him, reinforced this official version while potentially serving his political needs by demonstrating humility before the church. The system he created allowed him to benefit from actions taken in his interest while officially disavowing them when convenient, a form of reality distortion that operated through carefully maintained ambiguity about intent and authorization. Henry died in 1189, having perfected this approach to power, leaving behind a legacy where the king's actual wishes could be distinguished from his official positions only by those skilled at reading between carefully constructed lines of plausible denial. Number 8. Queen Elizabeth I, the calculated ambiguity of power. Queen Elizabeth I, who ruled England from 1558 to 1603, wielded ambiguity and carefully controlled information as tools of governance, creating situations where the truth about her intentions, decisions, and even basic facts of state became whatever interpretation best served her immediate political needs. Born in 1533 into a world where clarity could be fatal, Elizabeth developed the ability to present multiple versions of reality simultaneously, allowing different audiences to believe different things, while she committed to nothing that might later prove inconvenient. The Crown insisted on whatever version of events best served current circumstances. Historical sources document Elizabeth's famous indecisiveness on matters from marriage to military intervention as not merely caution, but deliberate strategy. By refusing to commit clearly to positions, she forced others to act on assumptions about her wishes, while preserving her ability to disavow those actions if they failed. Her advisors learned to navigate a system where the Queen's true intentions remained perpetually unclear, creating a court culture where everyone interpreted royal signals differently, yet each believed their interpretation was correct. Reality suggested a monarch who wielded uncertainty as a weapon. Elizabeth's treatment of Mary, Queen of Scots, demonstrated this approach perfectly. For years, she maintained the fiction that she wished to preserve her cousin, while creating conditions that made Mary's execution increasingly inevitable. When Mary was finally executed in 1587, Elizabeth insisted she had never authorized it, that the warrant had been carried out against her wishes, requiring everyone to accept a version of events that conveniently absolved her of responsibility for an outcome her policies had steadily advanced toward. Yet the narrative remained that Elizabeth governed with transparent wisdom and clear purpose, even as her actual positions on crucial matters remained deliberately opaque. Her response to marriage proposals demonstrated this pattern. She would encourage suitors enough to maintain diplomatic value while never committing clearly enough to be held to promises, creating a situation where she benefited from ambiguity while others bore the costs of acting on misinterpreted signals. Elizabeth died in 1603, having ruled for 45 years without ever allowing subjects to pin down her true positions on matters she wished to keep fluid. Her reign demonstrating how systematic ambiguity can become a form of reality control, where the truth becomes whatever the crown finds most useful at a nigh given moment, with everyone else forced to navigate a landscape where certainty was deliberately withheld. Number 9. King Edward IV, the repeated erasure of inconvenient facts. King Edward IV, who ruled England from 1461 to 1470, and again from 1471 to 1483, with a brief interruption, demonstrated remarkable capacity for declaring political settlements final and questioning resolved, even as evidence suggested ongoing instability and contested legitimacy. Born in 1442 during the Wars of the Roses, Edward developed the ability to present each phase of dynastic conflict as definitively settled, requiring subjects to accept that previous uncertainties had been permanently resolved, regardless of how fragile that settlement appeared. The Crown insisted after Edward's initial seizure of power that the Lancastrian claim was permanently defeated and the Yorkist succession beyond question. Historical sources document how Edward's government presented his kingship as restoring natural order after Lancastrian usurpation, a narrative that required everyone to forget that the situation had looked quite different just years earlier. When Edward was briefly deposed in 1470 and Henry VI temporarily restored, then Edward regained power in 1471, the Crown insisted this interruption was meaningless, that Edward's legitimate rule had merely been temporarily interrupted by treachery rather than revealing the contested nature of his claim. Reality suggested a kingdom where dynastic legitimacy remained genuinely disputed and political stability was far more fragile than official narratives claimed. The speed with which Edward's support had evaporated in 1470 and the equal speed with which he had regained power in 1471 demonstrated that loyalty was conditional and the settlement was contested. Yet the Crown's narrative insisted on finality and certainty, requiring subjects to believe each phase represented permanent resolution rather than temporary advantage in an ongoing struggle. Yet the narrative remained that Edward ruled by unquestionable right, and that opposition represented moral failure rather than legitimate political difference. His treatment of those who had supported Henry during the readeption required everyone to forget they had recently viewed the situation quite differently. The ease with which Edward regained power suggests many had maintained quiet reservations about the permanence of Henry's restoration, demonstrating how thoroughly the Crown's insistence on certainty had failed to convince even those who publicly affirmed it. Edward died in 1483, having maintained this fiction of permanent settlement, leaving behind a situation so unstable that his brother seized power within months, revealing how thoroughly the claimed certainty had been performance rather than reality. Number 10. King William II, order through intimidation. King William II, known as William Rufus, who ruled England from 1087 to 1100, governed through a framework that presented his arbitrary and often cruel decisions as the natural workings of legitimate authority, creating a system where questioning his actions became indistinguishable from challenging the concept of order itself. Born around 1060, as the third son of William the Conqueror, Rufus inherited his father's throne through circumstances that left his legitimacy somewhat contested, apparently shaping his approach to power as requiring absolute control over how his rule was interpreted and discussed. The Crown insisted that William's decisions, however harsh or apparently capricious, represented justice and proper governance. Historical sources document a reign marked by heavy taxation, conflict with the church, and treatment of nobles that many found oppressive. Yet the king's narrative framed all of this as necessary maintenance of order. Opposition was characterized not as legitimate grievance, but as ignorance of proper governance or deliberate troublemaking, creating a framework where the king's interpretation of his own actions was the only permissible one. Reality suggested a king whose relationship with his subjects was marked more by fear than genuine acceptance of his authority. Contemporary chronicles describe William as inspiring dread rather than loyalty, his court characterized by an atmosphere where frankness became dangerous and conforming to the king's version of events became essential for survival. His conflicts with Anselm, Archbishop of Canterbury, demonstrated how this framework operated. The Crown insisted that William's positions on church matters were reasonable, and that resistance came from Anselm's stubbornness, rather than the king's overreach. Yet the narrative remained that William governed wisely, and that problems arose from subjects failing to understand or properly submit to legitimate authority. Those who suggested his taxation was excessive or his treatment of the church problematic found themselves characterized as malcontents, unable to grasp the necessities of governance. The system created an environment where the king's version of reality was enforced through intimidation, with careers and positions depending on affirming rather than questioning official interpretations. William died in August 1100 in a hunting accident, whose circumstances remain mysterious, having ruled 13 years through a combination of force and reality control that made subjects learn to describe his governance in the terms he demanded regardless of their private assessments of his number 11, King John, the reframing of failure as betrayal. King John, who ruled England from 1199 to 1216, possessed a remarkable capacity for interpreting his own strategic failures and policy disasters as evidence of others' disloyalty rather than his own poor judgment, creating a framework where every setback reinforced his narrative of being betrayed rather than being ineffective. Born in 1166 as Henry II's youngest son, John apparently developed early the habit of externalizing responsibility for problems, a tendency that intensified when he gained power and faced consequences he could not escape but refused to accept as his own fault. The Crown insisted that the loss of Normandy to France in 1204 resulted from his baron's treachery rather than his own military and diplomatic failures. Historical sources document a campaign marked by John's strategic errors and inability to inspire loyalty among those who might have supported him. Yet the king's narrative consistently framed these events as betrayal by those who should have fought harder. This reframing allowed John to maintain his self-image as a capable leader, undermined by disloyal subjects, rather than facing the evidence that his leadership itself was the problem. Reality suggested a king whose suspicious nature and harsh treatment of nobles created the very disloyalty he claimed to be defending against. His treatment of noble families, including seizing estates on flimsy pretexts and making unreasonable financial demands, generated genuine grievances that he then interpreted as proof of inherent treachery rather than as predictable responses to his own actions. This created a cycle where his harsh responses to suspected disloyalty generated actual opposition, which he then used as evidence that his initial suspicions had been justified. Yet the narrative remained that John was a capable king betrayed by ungrateful subjects, that his failures stemmed from others' moral deficiencies rather than his own choices. His forced signing of Magna Carta in 1215 should have provided clear evidence that his interpretation of events differed dramatically from how his barons understood the same circumstances. Yet even this humiliation he framed as temporary setback, caused by treachery that would be avenged when he regained strength. John died in October 1216 during the civil war that followed his attempt to void Magna Carta, having spent his entire reign reframing his inadequacies as others' betrayals, demonstrating how thoroughly one can maintain an alternative version of reality when every incentive supports avoiding ng honest self-assessment about the actual causes of repeated failures. Number 12. King Henry VII, the retroactive justification of power. King Henry VII, who ruled England from 1485 to 1509, constructed after his victory at Bosworth Field an elaborate narrative that reframed his tenuous claim to the throne and military seizure of power as the inevitable restoration of rightful order, requiring the nation to accept a version of recent history that served his legitimacy regardless of how events had actually unfolded. Born in 1457, with a claim to the throne that was distant and complicated, Henry demonstrated, after gaining power through force, a masterful ability to reshape how his accession should be understood and discussed. The Crown insisted that Henry's victory represented divine judgment, restoring proper succession after years of Yorkist usurpation, a narrative that required significant reinterpretation of recent history. Historical sources document how Henry's government worked systematically to establish this framework, declaring that his reign began the day before the Battle of Bosworth, so that those who fought against him could be legally considered traitors. This retroactive dating demonstrated the Crown's willingness to manipulate basic facts to support its preferred narrative of legitimate succession rather than military coup. Reality suggested a more complex situation where Henry's claim was weak enough that it required reinforcement through marriage to Elizabeth of York and ongoing suppression of potentially stronger Yorkist claims. The persistence of pretenders and rebellions throughout his reign revealed that significant portions of the kingdom never fully accepted the official narrative of his unquestionable right to rule. Yet the Crown maintained unwavering insistence that these challenges represented treasonous rejection of legitimate authority rather than understandable skepticism about claims that had been imposed through military victory. Yet the narrative remained that Henry's accession had resolved England's dynastic uncertainties and restored stability after years of civil war. His government's treatment of historical records from the previous reigns demonstrated systematic effort to control how the past would be understood, ensuring that the official version of events supported Lancastrian legitimacy and Yorkist usurpation. Those who suggested alternative interpretations or questioned the completeness of Henry's right to rule faced consequences that encouraged others to embrace the official narrative regardless of their private doubts. Henry died in 1509, having established his dynasty firmly enough that his son inherited without challenge, demonstrating that sufficiently sustained and enforced reality control can eventually become accepted truth, with alternative interpretations fading as those who remembered events differently either conformed or disappeared from positions where their memories mattered. Number 13. King Edward I, the moral framework of conquest. King Edward I, who ruled England from 1272 to 1307, possessed remarkable ability to frame his wars of conquest in Wales and Scotland as righteous responses to disorder and rebellion rather than aggressive expansion, creating a moral framework that required subjects to view systematic subjugation as the restoration of proper order. Born in 1239, Edward developed early a worldview where his authority was self-evidently legitimate, and resistance to it was by definition unjust, allowing him to pursue campaigns of conquest while maintaining narratives of defensive necessity and moral righteousness. The Crown insisted that Edward's Welsh campaigns were responses to Welsh aggression and disorder rather than deliberate wars of conquest. Historical sources document how Edward's government framed each stage of his Welsh wars as necessary reaction to Welsh rebellion against authority they were obligated to respect, a narrative that required ignoring the question of whether that authority was legitimately established in the first place. The construction of massive castles across Wales and the systematic suppression of Welsh political structures revealed the conquest's true nature. Yet the official narrative maintained that Edward was merely establishing order where chaos had reigned. Reality suggested campaigns designed from the start to eliminate Welsh independence and incorporate Wales into England's kingdom. The thoroughness of Edward's settlement, including bringing in English colonists and imposing English law, demonstrated intentions that went far beyond simply stopping rebellion. Yet the Crown's version insisted these measures were necessary responses to Welsh intransigence rather than planned subjugation, framing the elimination of Welsh independence as the unfortunate but inevitable consequence of Welsh leaders' refusal to accept proper authority. Yet the narrative remained that Edward's actions in Wales and later Scotland represented the establishment of rightful order rather than aggressive conquest. His treatment of William Wallace and his removal of the Stone of Scone to Westminster were presented as legitimate responses to rebellion rather than symbolic assertions of conquest. The systematic nature of Edward's approach to subordinating Wales and attempting to subordinate Scotland was reframed as patient efforts to establish order among peoples who would benefit from proper governance. Edward died in 1307, still prosecuting his Scottish campaigns, having spent decades framing conquest as conflict resolution and subjugation as the establishment of proper authority, demonstrating how thoroughly moral frameworks can be constructed to justify actions that, described differently, would appear as straightforward aggression and domination. Number 14. King Henry III, the persistent denial of noble discontent. King Henry III, who ruled England from 1216 to 1272 in one of the longest reigns in English history, maintained throughout decades of visible noble opposition a narrative that his rule enjoyed proper support and that dissatisfaction came from malcontents rather than representing legitimate grievance about his governance. Born in 1207, Henry inherited the throne as a child during civil war and apparently never developed the ability to distinguish between the deference shown to his office and genuine support for his person and policies. The Crown insisted that Henry's decisions in matters from taxation to foreign policy to the appointment of favourites enjoyed his subjects' support, even as evidence accumulated that significant portions of the nobility found his rule problematic. Historical sources document recurring conflicts between Henry and his barons over issues that the king seemed genuinely unable to understand as legitimate concerns, instead interpreting them as isolated troubles caused by difficult individuals rather than systemic dissatisfaction with his approach to governance. Reality suggested a kingdom where noble discontent was widespread and based on substantial grievances about the king's favoritism toward foreign advisors, his expensive and ineffective foreign policies, and his resistance to baronial counsel on matters affecting the realm. The provisions of Oxford in 1258, which effectively limited royal power and established a council to oversee governance, should have made clear the extent of noble dissatisfaction. Yet Henry's response suggested he viewed this as temporary imposition by troublemakers, rather than evidence that his interpretation of his own effectiveness differed dramatically from how his nobles assessed the same reign. Yet the narrative remained that Henry ruled wisely and that problems arose from a minority of difficult barons unwilling to accept proper royal authority. His eventual military defeat by Simon de Montfort in 1264, which left him briefly imprisoned, demonstrated how thoroughly disconnected his version of events had become from political reality. Even after his son Edward rescued him and restored his power, Henry appeared to maintain his interpretation of events as involving betrayal by ungrateful subjects, rather than facing evidence that his governance had generated genuine opposition. Henry died in 1272, having ruled for 56 years, while maintaining a consistent gap between how he understood his reign and how many of his subjects experienced it, demonstrating how sustained reality distortion can persist across decades when mechanisms for forcing honest assessment remain undeveloped or ineffective. Number 15. King George I, delegating reality interpretation. King George I, who ruled England from 1714 to 1727, managed the challenge of governing a kingdom whose language he never learned by essentially delegating the interpretation of political reality to ministers who could mediate between his understanding and what was actually occurring, creating a system where the truth about governance became filtered through intermediaries with their own interests in how events were characterized and understood. The Crown operated through a framework where George's actual comprehension of English politics remained limited, while official versions insisted on his engaged and effective leadership. Historical sources document that George conducted business through translators and relied heavily on ministers, particularly Robert Walpole, to explain English political circumstances. This created unusual dynamics where the king's understanding of his own kingdom was necessarily mediated, and those doing the mediating had considerable power to shape how George interpreted events and how his responses were understood by his subjects. Reality suggested a system where the gap between what was happening and what George understood to be happening created opportunities for those with access to shape both his perceptions and the official narrative about his reign. His frequent absences in Hanover, where he spent months at a time away from his English kingdom, further complicated the question of who was actually governing and how decisions attributed to the king related to his actual involvement or understanding. Yet the narrative remained that George governed effectively and understood his kingdom's affairs, that his reliance on ministers represented wise delegation rather than necessity, born from his inability to directly engage with English politics. Those who suggested the king's distance from actual governance created problematic dynamics, found their concerns characterized as disloyalty rather than legitimate observation about how the system functioned. George died in June 1727 while visiting Hanover, having spent 13 years as King of England while maintaining substantial emotional and political distance from the kingdom, demonstrating how reality distortion can operate through delegation when the gap between official narrative and actual circumstances is managed by intermediaries whose interests lie in maintaining rather than correcting misunderstandings about how power actually functions. Number 16. King George II, the fiction of unchanging influence. King George II, who ruled from 1727 to 1760, maintained throughout his 33-year reign a narrative of undiminished royal authority, even as the practical reality of governance shifted increasingly toward ministers and parliament, requiring a sustained fiction that the king's role remained what it had been for his predecessors, despite visible evidence of declining royal power over actual policy decisions. The Crown insisted that George exercised meaningful authority over governance, that his decisions shaped policy and his will directed government action. Historical sources document a more complex reality where the development of cabinet government and the increasing importance of parliamentary politics meant that the king's actual influence was far more circumscribed than official narratives suggested. George attended cabinet meetings and was consulted on matters of state, but the gap between consultation and actual control grew steadily throughout his reign. Reality suggested a political system evolving toward forms that would eventually characterize constitutional monarchy, where the king's role became increasingly ceremonial, despite continued official insistence on royal authority. George's relationship with Robert Walpole and later ministers demonstrated these dynamics, where the fiction of royal direction had to be maintained even as practical power resided elsewhere. The king's genuine interest in military affairs and foreign policy, particularly regarding Hanover, provided areas where his engagement was real, but even here the constraints of English politics limited how his preferences could be translated into action. Yet the narrative remained that George governed his kingdom with authority comparable to his predecessors, that the evolution of political structures didn't fundamentally alter the king's role or power. Those who suggested that England was developing governmental forms where royal authority was increasingly titular rather than practical faced accusations of disloyalty to the crown. George died in October 1760, having maintained this fiction throughout his reign, demonstrating how institutional evolution can occur while official narratives insist on unchanging structures, with everyone involved understanding the gap between description and reality, yet maintaining the agreed-upon version, rather than openly acknowledging the transformation of how power actually operated. Number 17. Queen Anne. Unity through advisors. Queen Anne, who ruled from 1702 to 1714, governed during a period of significant political division while maintaining a public narrative of unity and her own decisive leadership, even as those close to the court understood that much of governance occurred through the competing influences of advisors who shaped both policy and how Anne's role in that policy-making was publicly characterized and understood. The Crown presented Anne as an engaged and decisive monarch, making considered judgments about matters of state. Historical sources document a more complex reality, where Anne's relationships with favourites, particularly Sarah Churchill and later Abigail Masham, significantly influenced both policy decisions and political appointments. The transition from Sarah's influence to Abigail's corresponded with major political shifts, yet the official narrative maintained that these were the Queen's own considered decisions, rather than reflecting whose advice currently held sway. Reality suggested a queen whose health problems and personal inclinations meant that governance involved considerable mediation through advisors, yet the system required maintaining fictions about Anne's direct control and independent judgment. The War of Spanish Succession and the complex politics surrounding it were officially directed by the Queen's will, even as observers understood that various factions competed for influence through access to Anne and ability to shape how information and options were presented to her. Yet the narrative remained that Anne governed through her own wisdom and judgment, that political shifts during her reign reflected her considered assessments rather than the influence of those who had her ear at different times. The maintenance of this official version required courtiers and politicians to characterize decisions in ways that emphasized royal agency, even when the actual processes of decision-making suggested more complex dynamics. Anne died in August 1714, having ruled 12 years, through a system where the gap between official narrative and actual governance was understood by insiders, yet maintained for public consumption, demonstrating how reality distortion can operate through collective agreement to describe power structures in ways that serve institution needs rather than reflecting the messy reality of how decisions actually get made. Number 18. King Edward II, surrounded by affirming voices. King Edward II, who ruled England from 1307 to 1327, created around himself an environment where his interpretations of political reality went largely unchallenged by those closest to him, building a court culture that reinforced his perspectives even as his actual political position deteriorated catastrophically. Born in 1284 as Edward I's son, he apparently never developed the ability to assess political situations independently of what those he favoured told him, creating dynamics where reality became what his inner circle affirmed rather than what broader circumstances suggested. The Crown operated through frameworks shaped by Edward's intense relationships with favourites like Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser, who naturally had incentives to present situations in ways that served their own interests while reinforcing Edward's existing beliefs. Historical sources document how Edward's court developed dynamics where those who might have offered difficult truths found themselves excluded, while those who affirmed the king's perceptions maintained access and influence, creating an environment where Edward's understanding of his own political strength and his favourites' acceptability to the nobility became increasingly divorced from reality. Reality suggested a kingdom where Edward's prioritization of his favourites' interests over effective governance generated genuine and growing opposition. Yet the court culture apparently prevented this information from reaching Edward in ways he would accept as valid. His shock when nobles moved against Gaveston, and later his inability to recognise the danger to the Despensers, demonstrated how thoroughly he had been insulated from understanding how his actions appeared to those outside his immediate circle. Yet the narrative within Edward's court remained that opposition came from a few difficult nobles who refused to accept legitimate royal choices, that the king's judgment was sound and his favourites were unjustly maligned. This closed information loop contributed directly to Edward's political collapse and eventual deposition, demonstrating how dangerous it becomes when those in power surround themselves exclusively with voices that confirm rather than challenge their existing beliefs. Edward died in captivity in September 1327, apparently still struggling to understand how his reign had unravelled, his life demonstrating how reality distortion can emerge not from malice, but from creating environments where difficult truths cannot reach those who most need to hear them. And so our journey through 18 royals who shaped reality to maintain power comes to a close. From Henry VIII's systematic revision of truth to Edward II's isolation in affirming voices, from Mary I's reframing of persecution as salvation to Elizabeth's weaponization of ambiguity, We've witnessed how crowns were maintained not just through force, but through the careful manipulation of what subjects were permitted to believe and remember. These stories reveal an uncomfortable truth about power. Those who hold it often possess not just the ability to shape events, but to control how those events are understood, remembered, and discussed. Some wielded this power consciously and systematically. Others created systems that distorted reality almost accidentally through the incentives surrounding monarchy. What connects all 18 is the demonstration that truth becomes surprisingly flexible when sufficient power supports alternative versions of it. Perhaps most disturbing is recognizing how these patterns persist in different forms. How the techniques of reality control we've explored tonight weren't limited to distant centuries, but represent enduring aspects of how power operates when unchecked. The monarchs we've discussed are safely historical, but the dynamics they employed, the systematic distortion of truth, the punishment of those who remember differently, the creation of systems where reality becomes whatever serves power, these patterns remain worth understanding and recognizing. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps you'll reflect that the antidote to reality distortion has always been the same. Insisting on the right to trust your own perceptions, to remember what you witnessed, and to speak truth even when power insists on different narratives. Thank you for joining this exploration of how power shapes truth. Rest well.